Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas.
And I just immediately fell in love with this idea of improvising solely based around creating variations of a melody, as opposed to what I had learned as a jazz student for decades at that point, which was sort of this obsession with harmony and arpeggiating chords and chord scale theory and all that stuff. I'd grown up learning jazz and learning how to play that way, and I think it never really resonated with me. I always kind of struggled with it and didn't love playing in that way. And then it was like a light switch when I discovered that there was this other style of music that was also virtuosic, which is something I enjoy, and also incorporated improvising, which is something that I enjoy, but that the framework for how you improvise was just completely different.
Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jamalong, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. Hey everybody, welcome back to Bluegrass Jamalong. My guest on the podcast this week is Eddie Barbash, and when I started this podcast, I didn't think I would be interviewing a bluegrass saxophone player, and that is what I'm doing, and it was a lot of fun. I already knew about Eddie. He had toured with Sierra Hull, and I'd seen some videos of them playing together, and he was kind of on my radar. He plays with Corey Wong, and was somebody that I knew about, but I didn't know. And he got in touch. He'd been chatting to Sarah Jaros about a project he was working on, and she'd suggested he got in touch with me. So thank you for that, Sarah. That was fantastic. And basically, Eddie's been working on a project recording fiddle tunes on the saxophone, and it sounds like that's a pretty simple thing. But as you'll discover as we go through this next sort of 45 minutes of conversation, just the level he's thinking about this on and the reasons why he's doing it and the kind of process that Eddie's gone through. And it's a fascinating kind of, not only is it an insight into how a different instrument works, but it's also a really cool insight into like a little holding up a mirror into like what we do as string band musicians and bluegrass musicians and seeing it from somebody else's perspective. And the whole thing was just fascinating. He's a really interesting guy, obviously an incredible musician as well. And I really enjoyed talking about this, and I hope you enjoy listening to it. Usual housekeeping bits and pieces before we crack on with the interview. If you want to support Bluegrass Jamalong and keep this content coming, you can do so via subscribing on Apple Podcasts, or you can click on the support the show link in the show notes. But what I want more than anything really is for you to recommend this podcast. So if you've got friends who love bluegrass, people you think might enjoy this episode, just send them a link and tell them to have a listen. That is it. Let's listen to Eddie Barbash chatting about bluegrass on the saxophone. Eddie, welcome to the podcast. It is great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Often when I do some prep for an interview, I listen to some music, I do some reading, and I think of an interesting starting question. And this one was really easy because there's such an obvious starting question here, and that is, why, as a saxophone player, have you chosen to make a record of fiddle tunes?
I just love the music so much. I got into it, maybe 10 years ago now, at least. I could talk forever about how I fell in love with it and that whole process, but yeah, I fell in love with it, and I've been trying to figure out how to make those tunes sound good on saxophone for a long time. And up until now, it's really only been documented in Instagram videos, which are and I've played on a few people's records, but aside from that, the Instagram thing, which is so fleeting, I just wanted to get down kind of what I had figured out in a more official way. And I chose to do it solo because I really didn't want to. The two things I was afraid of were either doing something where I had the saxophone playing fiddle tunes with a non-traditional instrumentation, which could sound like fusion, which was something I didn't want to do. That has its place, but that's not really been what I've pursued with learning this music. And then I was concerned if I did it with a traditional instrumentation, like a string band with saxophone, the saxophone would come off as a novelty. So I thought to myself, well, I've spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours, certainly thousands of hours at this point, playing fiddle tunes by myself in my practice room. So why not document it this way?
Well, that's really interesting, and I'm keen to kind of come back to the kind of your route into this music later, but that kind of sets up some interesting stuff to explore immediately, like that idea of transitioning music. And we say fiddle tunes, and often that includes banjo tunes and some mandolin tunes, but fiddle is the primary thing here. And I'm really interested in how you kind of transition, because fiddle, in my ears, fiddle and saxophone are often the instruments people struggle with when they start, because it's about getting a lovely clean tone beyond anything.
Yeah,
but
very
then,
true.
like a bow versus breath in terms of how you articulate, there are many ways to bow. Like this must have been a kind of ground up exercise in learning to breathe again almost.
Yeah, I mean, figuring out there's just so much variation in bowing, like you said, that can be used to create rhythm. Which is why the solo fiddle tradition is such a thing and why it works so well. It feels so complete, rhythmically complete. So trying to figure out how to play in a way where I could create similar sort of timbre changes that helped drive the rhythm in different ways. So some of that has definitely been breath stuff. A lot of it has been articulation stuff, which is essentially how the tongue touches the reed. And I've figured out different things where I can imitate sort of the way sometimes, if a fiddle, especially in old time, will get this kind of pulsing feel where they're not actually changing bow direction, but like maybe they're doing a string crossing thing where they're hitting a drone string, or maybe sometimes they just kind of push the bow a little harder and it changes the timbre. I found that I can do something like that if I touch my tongue to the reed, but not fully stop the flow of air. So it just kind of changes the timbre and has this, which gives me another sort of thing to play with when creating rhythm, as opposed to my imitation of, or my version of a bow change, which is just fully articulating and stopping the air and starting it again. So yeah, learning how to use that technique has been really helpful.
And it's been really interesting to listen to the tracks, because there are places where kind of it sounds like it sounds nuts to say this, but bowing decisions being made. And then there's other tracks, really fast tracks like Fork of Deer, for example, where just this classic sort of bluegrass kind of churn of notes. And the decisions you're making are more about which note to pop out of the stream and to kind of where to syncopate and where to accent. And I find that fascinating, because there's something, those kind of just stream of 16th note kind of tunes can just be rattled off. But where you choose to pop those notes out is really interesting choices being made.
It's so cool how, to me, one of the things I love about fiddle music is that even when it is a constant stream of 16th notes, there's so much rhythmic stuff going on with those choices about where the bow changes happen, or where the accents happen, or where you hit a double stop, if you're playing a fiddle, something like that. The rhythm can be on paper just 16th notes, but then when you hear it, it's got all kinds of polyrhythms built into it based on the way you're accenting. So trying to capture that is a big part of it for me.
And that's another interesting point there, because with the fiddle styles, you do have the kind of double stop ability in turn. That can be a big part of the kind of accompaniment and the rhythm that you can kind of accompany yourself on a fiddle almost. And the sax is obviously one note at a time, and so there's choices to be made there as well. But it is fascinating. It's like you get the same feeling sometimes from listening to people play like some of the Bach partitas or whatever. And it's where you choose to place the, I've been listening to Chris Thiele's recent Volume 2, some of the stuff from that record, and just his choices of where he's going to highlight a note for you, or it makes what could just be a stream of notes endlessly interesting.
Yeah, actually a Bach piece that I've played a lot recently that I love for that reason is the prelude to the second cello suite. One da 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 da. That one, a lot of it is just sort of a stream of, I don't know if they're eighth notes or 16th notes, but with where you choose to do your rubato, it's almost like, I feel like the piece is like it's like a fractal. You can choose different shapes. It's like shapes within shapes within shapes, and you can choose different ones to bring out. It's like, is the pattern this or is the pattern this? You know, it's these overlapping patterns. And it's so fun to mess around with. You can almost change the melody by just where you decide, which notes you decide to hang on to a little longer, or which ones you put vibrato on, or something like that.
And with these fiddle tunes, like you come to it now as a guitar player, mandolin player, whoever, and there are decades worth of versions of these tunes and recordings of them, but presumably as a sax player you're kind of creating your own way of looking at them, because there's nobody really done this before. So how do you approach that?
Well, my process, the best is when I learn a tune from somebody. You know, that's really the tradition of this music. So I always feel I know a tune most intimately when I've just learned it from somebody or learned it in a jam. But when I don't learn a tune that way, and I'm learning it off a recording, what I tend to do is I love how in the fiddle tradition, every instrument has its own version, sort of variation of a tune that suits that instrument. So I'll listen to how it's played on every instrument. Typically, find some of my favorite players, or I'll go on the Slippery Hill website and try to find, the oldest recordings of it or something like that. And I'll sort of grab the variations that feel the best on saxophone from the way each instrument plays it. And then sometimes there's certain sections that just kind of don't quite work no matter what instrument I listen to, and then I'll kind of do what I need to do to make it feel more natural on saxophone. I'm always sort of dancing this line, kind of this like dancing this line of trying to work really hard to make something work versus taking the more Taoist approach of finding the easiest way to do it. So I'm always kind of asking myself the question, if I put in 100 hours on this, is it going to be worth it? Or is it a better choice to search for an easier, more natural way to play this part of the tune?
That kind of problem solving is a massive part of instrumental technique. Going back as far as whenever, isn't it? It's working out, can you do this? Which is a challenge. Yeah. Sometimes that's the challenge to be accepted, is can I do this? And sometimes it's just, how can I best almost do this?
Exactly. Or the question of, is a different version ultimately going to sound better than even if I could learn how to do it? For example, like a lot of tunes, I end up, especially if I'm playing them in the original fiddle keys, I end up having to take the B parts down an octave. And some of them, a lot of them, if I put in the time, could be played in the proper octave. But I'm fairly certain from listening to other virtuoso, classical saxophonists and whatnot, that even if I did put in the thousands of hours to learn how to play it in the right octave, it would always just sound too extravagant or virtuosic, because it would, no matter how effortless I could get it to sound, it would be like, wow, that saxophone's playing high, which is not the point of the tune going up there for the B part often. Sometimes it is, and then in those instances I do go for it, but often it's not. And then I come up with a version, I either take the melody down an octave or come up with a version where certain parts of it drop down an octave, but still like maintain the integrity of the melody. Because to me, that is not only easier, but serves the sound of the music better.
Yeah, well, keys is an interesting one, isn't it? Because I've never played a wind instrument, but string instruments tend to lend themselves to kind of sharp keys, and wind instruments tend to lend themselves more to flat keys. And often string players struggle a little bit going in the jazz direction because they've got to learn to play in B flat and E flat and keys like that. Is that a challenge as a wind player to kind of move more? Because most fiddle tunes are written in sharp keys.
I mean, honestly, at this point, I've been playing fiddle tunes so long that I'm as comfortable in the sharp keys as I am in the flat keys. And while I think there's some truth to the statement that wind instruments lend themselves to flat keys, I think it's less true than it is for string instruments lending themselves to sharp keys. Because the technical hurdles that you come up against playing sharp keys are not nearly as significant as the technical hurdles you come up against playing in flat keys on string instruments. And I would say on saxophone, there's really only maybe 2 sharp keys that I would say are even objectively technically more difficult. They're sort of in the key of concert D, which ends up being B on the alto saxophone, and the key of concert A, which ends up being F sharp on saxophone. There's this sort of strange cross-fingering thing that happens between the note C sharp and D that makes it objectively more difficult than any other key. But G, for example, is E on saxophone, and so you don't have to contend with that. And, you know, a lot of the other keys, it's just not, I think it's kind of, even E, you know, as long as you don't have that C sharp to D situation going on, I think it's actually not any harder. It's just unfamiliar to most wind players.
And there isn't a rich tradition of fiddle tune music written in F sharp major, is there?
No. You know, ironically, the first fiddle tune I learned that got me really obsessed was Daly's Reel, which is in B flat, but I learned it from Jeff Picker, and he was playing guitar and he didn't have a capo, and so he taught it to me in G, but never told me that it was in B flat. And it wasn't until years later that I found out that the first fiddle tune I learned was actually a B flat tune.
Yeah, that's the joy of being a guitar player. You can just change keys without changing what you're playing, but you don't have that luxury as a sax player.
No, not quite.
So, well, that seems like an interesting point to ask about. You know, that was the first tune you learned, and you say you've been playing fiddle tunes for around 10 years, and I'd love to know kind of at what point that came into your radar and how and why that bug bit so hard.
Well, I had heard some of the music. I think I was first introduced to it by a guy named Rick Robertson, great sort of Americana singer-songwriter, and he plays multi-instrumentalist, but started out as a mandolinist. And so I was aware of it and had heard some bluegrass. I think the first record he played me was a Stanley Brothers record, or no, actually just a Ralph Stanley record, Clinch Mountain Gospel. But then the real sort of moment for me was Jeff Picker and I were at our friend's bachelor party weekend in the Catskills. We had rented a cabin and we were all just kind of hanging out, and he brought a guitar and taught me Daly's Reel. And I just immediately fell in love with this idea of improvising solely based around creating variations of a melody, as opposed to what I had learned as a jazz student for decades at that point, which was sort of this obsession with harmony and arpeggiating chords and chord scale theory and all that stuff. I'd grown up learning jazz and learning how to play that way, and I think it never really resonated with me. I always kind of struggled with it and didn't love playing in that way. And then it was like a light switch when I discovered that there was this other style of music that was also virtuosic, which is something I enjoy, and also incorporated improvising, which is something that I enjoy, but that the framework for how you improvise was just completely different, that it was all about creating these finding different ways to dance around the melody as opposed to the harmony. And so I just got, that was the start for me, was learning all these fiddle tunes kind of more in the bluegrass vein and just obsessing for hours and hours over trying to improvise variations on them. And then the deeper I went down the rabbit hole of the music, the more I learned about different kinds of music, fiddle music, and fell in love with different aspects of it. So the first thing was the improvising, and then the second thing that really hooked me was this idea of being able to be like a drum on a melody instrument, and the fact that you get to, so it was old time was kind of the next thing I gravitated towards, and discovering that, in a jazz context, you play saxophone, you play the melody, you take your solo, and then you stand around, while everyone else is soloing, and then like maybe you play the melody again at the end. You don't really do that much. It can be pretty boring. And anytime you're playing, it's all about, your moment. But then discovering old time and how the fact that as a melody instrument, I could be part of this sort of drum circle that was going on and play the whole time, and just this collaborative groove. It really, to me, old time feels like a drum circle with no drums, a drum circle made up of all melody. So realizing that I could participate in that as a single note instrument, and not as a percussion instrument, was really exciting. And then I got obsessed with the bowing stuff and trying to figure out how to groove on the saxophone in a way that felt good. And then kind of around the same time, maybe a little after that, I got really excited about Irish music, which I love for the same reason as old time, but then I also am just so captivated by the ornamentation and how sort of exotic it sounds. And I love the adventure of trying to figure out how to play these ornaments on saxophone.
Funnily enough, that was going to be the next question, was about, because bowing is one thing, but there's a couple of kind of Irish tunes on the record. And I was going to ask about ornamentation, because it is sort of, you hear that music and even if you don't know how to play it or understand it, just you expect to hear a level of ornamentation, whether it's a fiddle or a flute or pipes or whatever. It's just baked into that music, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. It's just another layer of rhythm, really. The ornaments are, in Irish music, you have all the bowing rhythm of old time, but then you also have this other layer of the rhythms that are created through the ornaments. The ornaments are essentially, they all come from the bagpipes, because the bagpipes can't articulate. So to create the sound of articulation, they use their fingers and the little blips. The ornaments are essentially their version of articulating, and then all the other instruments kind of started imitating that. So it's another rhythmic layer, and I love that about it. And I also just love how, maybe because I didn't grow up with it or something, it just sounds so exciting and exotic and magical to me. I hear, especially when I first started listening to Irish music, hearing it and just not knowing how they were doing what they were doing. It's kind of the same feeling as when I listen to Balkan music and hear the crazy ornamentation, and it's like, wow, what even is that? How are they making those sounds? So that it's been so exciting for me to try and figure that out. And it really, I kind of think of all the styles of fiddle music, I sort of think Irish music is the most transferable to the saxophone, because they have wind instruments in their music. They have flute and whistle, and the fingering is quite similar. And in the Balkans, you have all these styles of Roma music that have saxophone in them and clarinet in them. And a lot of the ornaments that they use the inflections are different, but some of the ornaments are exactly the same. They do rolls and they do cuts, just sort of with a slightly different timbre. So it's almost less unprecedented than trying to figure out how to play old time on saxophone.
I mean, it's funny just you were talking about rhythm there, and the people kind of draw, rightly or wrongly, people often draw parallels between jazz and bluegrass because they are based around kind of a collected canon of material everybody knows, and there's an improvisatory element. But I'd never really thought about it in these terms until just hearing you speak there. And there's a similar sort of arc to them in a way, in that you have that old time thing where music is played to be danced to, and it's a social thing and it's a group thing, and then as bluegrass develops, it becomes a little bit more about individual prowess and becomes kind of recorded music and concert music. And I wonder if that's the same with jazz, because swing was there for people to dance to it. And as the smaller groups and the, sort of 50s and 60s went on, and bebop, it became a little bit more about individuals and a bit more about listening and a bit more about, and so to kind of, it makes total sense that you would yearn for that sense of collective rhythm again and a kind of more communal experience. I don't know if this is making any sense at all, but it's kind of just...
Yeah. It's almost as if jazz music and bluegrass music were folk music, and they aren't anymore, a little bit. I mean, bluegrass certainly less so than jazz. And I guess when I say folk music, I mean social music as opposed to art music or performance music. Irish music and certainly old time are very much still, more than anything, social music. It's almost strange to go see an old time concert. It's like every old time show I've ever seen, they always throw in a bunch of other stuff like songs and things in order to make it feel more like a concert. They don't just sit up there and play tune after tune after tune the way you would at a dance. But bluegrass has, I think, it started its life as more of a social music and has become more of a performance music. Certainly that's the case with jazz. And
yet at their best, they're both the kind of music that when you hear it, you can't keep your feet still. I took my son's just about to turn 13 and he's getting really into jazz. We took him to see a big band at the weekend, and just that feeling of a swinging brass section and some drums, and
it's pretty good.
And it is about the collective power rather than people get up and take solos and all of that. But the excitement for me in that music is what happens when everybody's playing.
Yeah. I love playing in big band almost more than small jazz groups, again, for that reason, and because you get to play the whole time. You don't have to stand around.
We'll be right back with you just after this. The long-awaited Hill Country series from Collins Guitars represents a new voice in their acoustic lineup. Rooted deep in the bluegrass world, these new Dreadnought and OM models feature a strong fundamental tone with a dry, warm and woody character that's sure to catch the attention of players who hold the vintage instruments of the 30s in their highest regard. Watch world-class pickers Jake Workman, Kenny Smith and Bob Minner perform with new Hill Country instruments on the Collins Guitars YouTube channel, and learn more at collinsguitars.com. And I'm keen to talk about the record Larkspur, because it's interesting from the point of view of being a bunch of fiddle tunes played on saxophone, but it's also really interesting where and how you chose to record these, because it's not you sat in a studio just recording a bunch of fiddle tunes. There's a kind of a visual and performance and kind of context element to this as well, isn't there?
Yeah. So they're all videos. They were all shot as videos. Sort of the original impetus for that was that I knew that a solo saxophone record, particularly of fiddle tunes, was going to be so niche that the original thought was, if there could be another sort of point of entry for people to this, that would be good. The visual one. And for the same reason, actually, I've also made a transcription book that goes along with it, where I have everything written out, so that any other horn players that are interested in learning how to do it can see what's going on. But the more I think about it, I'm glad that I didn't do it in a studio, because I think it's earthy music, and it's not something that's supposed to be perfect, I don't think. And it's everything, with the exception of one tune. There's literally one edit point on the whole record. It's all just single takes, complete performances. And I just think, I think that's how this music's supposed to sound, especially because I'm not playing the tunes in any extremely progressive, experimental way. I kind of wanted, I feel that it's progressive enough to be playing it on a saxophone. So I really wanted to make it sound and feel as organic as possible. And I think recording it in this way, where there were these sort of limitations on what I could do in terms of studio tricks, helped me achieve that.
And you get, because they're recorded in Larkspur Conservation Natural Burial Ground in Tennessee, and you hear the space, and like on one level, there's no kind of room sound because there's no room.
Yeah.
But you get the sound of outside is part of the sound of being outside is part of them.
I was just going to say, the natural reverb you get from each different space is so cool too. I mean, there's no reverb added to any of it. It's just what, the reflections off of the trees and the nearby hills and stuff, which I think sounds amazing. I love it.
And there's an element of birdsong in there that kind of makes its way into an intro to one of the tracks.
Yeah.
And there's it's on Tennessee Mountain Fox Chase as well. It feels like there are tones you're bringing out of the sax on that kind of, the baying of the hounds is in there, and you hear a kind of like a horn, you hear, it's like a little tone painting as well as a fiddle tune, and I love all of that.
Yeah, there were a couple, I think there were 2 tunes on the record where I sort of improvised an intro that was something I hadn't planned on and hadn't practiced, and I think both times it wouldn't have happened if I had been in a studio, sort of inspired by the space and what was going on around me. Tennessee Mountain Fox Chase, there was a barn swallow flitting sort of over my head and nesting in the rafters right above the porch we were on. And there was just so many birds singing all around. It was really inspiring.
And is that a place that has some meaning for you? Was that chosen for a reason?
It wasn't initially. My producer John Seal knew it, and I think it had some meaning for him because he had met the guy who founded it, and he thinks their mission. He knew about their mission and loves it. And now that I've been there and seen it and met John Christian, who runs it, it's an incredible thing that they've got going on there. And I've decided that I want to be buried there. Unless I asked him, we asked him, are you going to be buried here? And he said, I don't know what other, he said, I don't know what other options I'll have created for myself by then. So what he's doing is he's at the forefront of this natural burial movement, which is basically what it sounds like. They bury people unembalmed, so there's no chemicals in their body, just wrapped in a shroud or in something organic. So they make some sort of coffin type things out of sort of woven willow branches and things like that sometimes. And they only bury people 3 feet deep and just put little simple markers, and it's just sort of dotted throughout the woods in this area. And the bodies just decompose and turn into the dirt, and they're in the forest. And in addition to being not bad for the environment in the way that embalming people and encasing them in concrete boxes and covering it with grass is, every body that gets buried there is essentially staking a claim on a piece of land that this land can never be developed because there's people buried here. So it's kind of conservation. It's like an insurance policy on the conservation to have people buried there.
Mm. Yeah, and like the most natural thing, just to kind of return to where you came from ultimately. And
yeah, I'm so glad to know about it.
And like, it sounds like with this music, a big part of your journey with it has been about playing it with other people. And presumably, I mean, I've no idea what it's like to turn up at a bluegrass or old time jam with a saxophone. Is that something that has ever been an issue, or is it a case of you're often jamming with people you know anyway, and it's just nobody even thinks about it?
Mostly the latter. I have always been really sensitive to the fact that I don't want to be the turd in the punch bowl, at a jam. So I've always tried to come really prepared and be really, really respectful. So the first jams I started going to were in New York City at a place called Mona's on Avenue B that has a bluegrass jam once a week that's still going. And I went for a long time without playing. Then there was one night I played penny whistle on a couple tunes. I had learned some tunes on penny whistle, and no one seemed to mind that. And sort of all the while I was making friends with people in the bluegrass scene and playing, going over to their houses and learning tunes and sort of just becoming a part of the scene that way. And then finally one night I showed up with some friends that were, loved pickers on the New York scene, and took out my horn and played, and it went great. Everybody was happy to have me there because I knew the tunes and I knew the jam session etiquette by that point. And then I think I got a text from the guy who led the jam maybe a couple days later saying something to the effect of, oh, it was so great to have you. You sounded great. You've clearly done your homework, but I don't want to set a precedent of horns playing at the jam. So let's limit your playing to 1 or 2 features a night when you come. And I understood where he was coming from, but then I, not out of spite, but just because I was busy, didn't end up going to the jam for maybe 3 or 4 months after that. And in the meantime, started booking gigs around New York with a lot of the best bluegrass musicians in town and starting to sit in on everybody's gigs and stuff. And then by the time I did go back to the jam 3 months later, I was such a known entity on the scene that there was nothing to be said at that point. And then it became a jam that I could play at all the time. So that was kind of the only real pushback I ever got, and it was pretty minimal. But there is always this, one thing I hate about playing the saxophone is that I'm always jealous of string players for, is the fact that the saxophone takes so long to put together. There's no fast approach. A fiddle in a jam, sometimes people will hear a tune that they like or they want to play, and they can get their instrument out and be playing it by the next chorus. Yeah. Saxophone, if I hear a tune I want to play on and I don't have my horn out, I'm not playing on that tune because it takes me at least, 4 minutes to get the reed wet and put it together. And so there's always this awkward moment when I'm at a jam where I don't know anybody, or most of the people don't know me. There's the 4 minutes where people are watching me put my horn together and they don't know what I'm going to sound like or what's going on. And they're like, oh, are you kidding me? What is this? And so that moment is always painful.
Yeah.
The first 4 minutes of sheepishly putting my saxophone together. But then once I play, everyone's always fine with it because I've got the element of surprise on my side.
And as somebody who spent his teenage years as a drummer and then spent a spell playing pedal steel, like they're 2 instruments that take ages to get out of your car and then set up, and then with the pedal steel get in tune. And then when I started playing mandolin, the joy of being able to just get something out and play.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then stick it on your back and hop on the bus home was just extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I guess kind of like beyond the sort of jam scene, people listening to this podcast are probably most likely to have seen you play with Sierra Holt, because you played together for a while, didn't you?
Yeah, about 3 years.
And how did that come about?
That was great. Well, I think in summer of 2017, I made a point of going to some fiddle camps, because I'd been hearing about all these fiddle camps from my friends, things that they had grown up going to and that they were now teaching at. So I set aside a chunk of time in the summer and I went to a bunch of fiddle camps. And one of them is a really interesting, fun camp that was called Shasta, that was sort of at the base of Mount Shasta, run by two siblings, Tristan and Tashina Claridge. And I met Ethan Yojevitz there, and we had some really fun jams. And then I think, so Sierra had made that record with Ethan, the duo record, and she'd been touring it at that point for a couple years already, and was kind of, hadn't made another record yet, but wanted to spice up her tour life and the gigs and make it feel different. And so she had the idea to start having a special guest do a couple tours, like have a third person. And I think she ended up asking me to do it because Ethan recommended me, and probably before Ethan recommended me, she had seen a video of me playing Bound to Ride with Jake Jolliffe, the mandolinist, on Facebook. And so it was the combination of Ethan saying, "Oh, why don't you get Eddie to do it? I just had a great time playing with him at Shasta," and already knowing who I was from that video. And so she called me up and told me, and it was a really exciting opportunity. I spent a week. I actually had a practice retreat with my friend up on Lake Champlain and spent a week practicing like 5 or 6 hours a day, and was just going through that album and all the tunes on it that she said she wanted to play, and sort of trying to insert myself, learn the tunes and write a third part to everything, which was a really fun challenge. And then I toured with her for about 3 years, and it was great. She's the best.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, incredible. And you mentioned earlier there's a transcription book that goes with this, and by the time this episode comes out, I think most of the videos will be out, and the record comes out in full on the 28th of November.
That's right.
And with the is the hope that more kind of reed players will learn these tunes, will hear you playing them and want to learn them and kind of get involved?
I don't really expect anybody to get as excited about learning how to do this on saxophone as I have, because it's so niche and there's really no reward for doing it, because the whole system is set up such that saxophone players are expected to play jazz and are rewarded for playing jazz. But a lot of people who've heard me do it are interested, and I've had a lot of saxophone players talk to me who maybe grew up with a family member who played bluegrass and grew up around it and just never thought to try to play it on saxophone. So maybe just kind of an easy entry point, because I always struggle when a saxophone player who hasn't tried at all asks me, "What should I listen to? What tunes should I learn?" It's been such a long and winding road for me to figure out how to play these tunes that I often don't know. I struggle with telling them where to start, because, like I was saying earlier, with learning the tunes, there's no... any tune you want to learn, there's really no one version of it that you can listen to that's going to be easily transferable to saxophone. So it's such a long process that this maybe will help some saxophone players get a grasp of some tunes without needing to do the same amount of work that I did to figure out how to make, Forked Deer work on saxophone. Sometimes I remember telling some saxophone player to check out Blackberry Blossom and the Tony Rice recording, but then I had to say, now learn the A sections from Tony, but then learn the B sections from the fiddle player, because what Tony plays on the B sections is just not playable on saxophone. It wouldn't work, But it's always something like that with these tunes.
Well, it's really interesting because when I started playing fiddle tunes, my biggest hurdle was just like getting my head around what the melody was, because like with some of the jazz standards, they've come from Cole Porter or Gershwin or somewhere, so
Exactly.
there is there's a pretty standard version of the head being recorded somewhere and written down, and it comes from a musical or whatever. But with old time and bluegrass stuff, like no chance.
Yeah.
But so I think that's why sometimes like the Tony Rice version of Gold Rush or Russ Barenberg's version of Big Skies have become these kind of standard reference versions, because people are looking for but then that element of translating them onto your instrument has usually been done for you. But
yeah,
it's really interesting. There seems to be like a constant thread of string band musicians kind of moving into other territories on their instruments and looking for ways to play, classical music, or to experiment with jazz, or to Latin music or whatever. There's a strong tradition of that, but there's a much less kind of traffic the other way of people bringing other instruments in and trying to learn how to play fiddle tunes on those. You have like maybe some of the Buddy Emmons records in the 70s, he's playing a couple of tunes on steel guitar, but it's much less common.
Yeah, it's really not much. It's one of the things I love to rail on and complain about is the fact that it seems to me that there's this one-sided love affair between string band music and jazz. All the best string band musicians know and love jazz and know about all the great contemporary jazz musicians. But it really doesn't go the other way, and it's always kind of mystified me as to why that's the case, because especially the modern string band music, to my ears, has everything that I would think a jazz musician would love. It's got virtuosity, it's got improvisation, it's rich and complex. It's, I can understand a jazz musician not being able to hear past, the cliches of banjo and hillbilly culture, if they're listening to some old time or even some Bill Monroe or something earlier. But listening to something like, Mike Barnett or Billy Contreras or Alex Hargraves or Hawktail or any of those bands, I don't understand why they don't hear that and immediately think it's incredible music that they want to be, that they want to know more about.
And was that period sort of in the 90s and slightly beyond where you had that Sony classical kind of confluence of like Edgar Meyer and like maybe Joshua Bell or Yo-Yo Ma, but Bela Fleck and Mike Marshall, and then on to things like Goat Radio Sessions, where there's this real kind of, melting pot. But it's like you say, there's that thing of jazz people stepping into... I talked to a guitarist called Ethan Sherman relatively recently for the podcast, and he's kind of made that transition. He said it was great. He said, I can't work out why more people don't do it.
There's
so
a
it's
couple.
fascinating.
There's a small handful. You see it mostly, there's really no horn players, but you see it with guitar players occasionally and bass players. There's a small handful that become interested. And there is more of a thing with classical music for some reason. There is a mutual respect in the classical world with the sort of progressive string band world.
Yeah, and I think increasingly as people have been to music college and studied, elements of that come into it as well. And you get a band like Hawktail, and half of them are equally as adept at classical music as they are at string band music, and Yeah, I mean, that's one of my favourite bits of the string band world, is that bit where it sits in a Venn diagram with jazz and classical, and there's equal amounts of improvisation and arrangement, and structure and freedom and all those things. This record is a fascinating thing. I've really enjoyed listening to the tune so far, and it's just been a joy to talk about it. It's been a very different conversation in many ways, but also so many of the same themes that come up talking to anybody about playing this music, and it's been great getting a chance to chat to you about it.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for taking the time.
Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas.